To begin a watercolor painting, start by waking up your paints. Just apply a couple drops of water in each color, so that way when you go to use them later, they're already ready to use. And you're not going to accidentally dig in your paint. If you notice, the lid of my watercolor set is off. That is because we're going to use that as a paint palette, and you may need to go wash it off occasionally throughout the project. If you noticed in your set of colors, you do not have white. So in order to lighten a color, you're going to need to apply it to your lid, and then you're going to need to water it down with water in order to make it lighter. Water equals lighter. Now we are going to be painting our first layer, which means we don't need it to be bright. We don't want to oversaturate our picture because we want to do this layer by layer to build dimension. So I'm being very careful, and I am applying my color only where I want it to be. I'm using a wet on dry technique, so I can control where it's going and it's not spreading all over my paper. Think of this layer as a base layer. You're just kind of mapping out where the colors are going according to your picture and getting your whole paper covered. Now that I've gotten all the red on the face of the chicken done, I'm going to move on to another color. The really hard part about watercolor is having patience. You don't want to paint next to an area that is wet unless you want it to blend. Okay, so what you're going to notice is as I switch to another color here, I am not painting next to the areas that are touching the red. I need to give it a little bit of time to dry before moving on to paint next to it, because I do not want those colors to blend. Now, this is a totally different story if you do want it to blend, but we'll talk about that later. Next, I'm going to move on to another area not touching that greenish blue color. The red should be pretty much dry, so now it's okay for me to do the next thing that's touching that. I am going to move on to the sky. When I move on to the sky, you're going to notice that I actually changed techniques. I had been doing a wet on dry, which means the paper was dry. But to do the sky, because I want it to blend out and be kind of a gradient where it goes from a dark to a light, I'm going to start by applying water in small sections first. Then I can add the color on top of it, and it's going to blend out a lot smoother, and I'm not going to worry about it drying too much on me, and I can add it on, it kind of like fuzzes out. Kind of more of a soft look for the sky. Remember that if you want to add details that are lighter, in this case with the sky, my clouds are white, do not paint where the white is going to be. We do not and will not be able to cover anything and make it white again. When you're looking at your photograph, the colors you have in your paint tray there are not the exact colors that you see in your photo. That is because those are our base colors. You need to use those to mix and make your own shade of colors according to your picture. That's why we have the lid to mix on. Now remember, even when you're grabbing from the lid, you might occasionally need to grab some more water because this is watercolors. I'm not worrying too much about making sure I get a lot of details that I see in my photo. I'm kind of just doing a base on it and not worrying about details, just getting it covered. The next layer, we will start looking at details. Now that I've just about finished the chicken, I'm moving on to my background details. I'm going to start with the trees and the green parts before moving on to the grass. If you look carefully at my drawing, my background details have a fence in it. Because that is so skinny, and because the fencing is actually a dark shade compared to my grass, I'm going to paint right over the top of those details. And I'm just going to worry about the grass color right now because I know that my dark brown / black will cover over that later. This technique only works if the color you're covering is going to be darker. Now it's time for us to start the second layer with watercolor. This layer is to darken those spots that have a darker shadow and make your color a little bit more vibrant. Keep in mind that not all parts are going to be darkened. Some parts need to stay lighter depending on your photo. All you have to do is look at your photo to get those answers. Don't forget that you have your paint palette there to mix your own colors. When you want to darken a color, consider other colors besides black first, because black is a very strong color. For instance, with this red, I'm going to mix a darker red using a brown instead of black. It's going to keep more color and not dull it out. With this second layer, you're going to start actually blocking in more details. Not all the details, but more of them. So for this part here where I did the whole big block of greenish blue, I'm now blocking in single feathers that I can see in my picture. This is what's going to make it look more realistic. I am paying attention not just to where the feathers are and the direction they're going, but I'm also paying attention to how dark things are and how light they are. So for instance, on these feathers, there's the spine of it and it's lighter. So I made sure to leave that part white. Don't forget that even in the second layer, you still have to let certain parts dry before you can paint right next to it. At the beginning of this, I started with the red of the chicken, and then I moved to the green feathers, giving the red time to dry, so that way now I can go back and do the sky. Now that the green feathers have dried while I painted the sky, now I can move on to the orangish red feathers. Remember to match your colors to your picture by mixing your own in your paint palette. It's important to remember that before you can start painting a section, you need to ensure that you have all of the colors made and ready to go. A lot of the watercolor techniques we learned require that you work quickly. I'm going to zoom in here to show you how I do trees. I have several different shades mixed and ready on my paint palette, and I'm using a very small brush because these trees are far away in the distance. Looking at my photograph, I am looking for the shadows and the highlights in the trees. All I'm going to do is gently tap the end of my brush onto the paper. You want to do this to leave a lot of texture and dimension to your trees instead of leaving them flat. This is really important, especially because we will not be using Prismacolors in the background. All of the detail for your background needs to be done with watercolors. So now that the watercolor is all dry, we can go back in with Prismacolors and we can add a lot more texture. Remember, we've talked about texture being the illusion that something is either bumpy, smooth, furry, everything that you can feel with your hands, but we're going to draw it and make it look like you can feel it, but it's not really there. To create these various textures, we're going to use the techniques that we've talked about previously in other projects. Recall that when I was making the tennis ball, and I used the scumbling technique to make it look like it was fuzzy, I am doing something similar here on the red part of the rooster to make it look a little rough and bumpy. I'm going to move my pencil in small little circular motions. Remember that you're not just coloring this one solid color. You also need to pay attention to the highlights, the shadows, and all those tones in between. I am using a white, a dark red, and a poppy red on this rooster. Here I have moved on to the beak. I'm still using the same concept of the highlights and the shadows, but now the beak of this rooster is actually smooth. So I'm going to use that burnishing technique where I make sure I keep doing layers and layers and layers until it gets very, very smooth. You're going to notice that because we have watercolor in the background, that it actually doesn't take as many layers of Prismacolor to build up all that color. The watercolor helps us with that. Now I've moved on to the feathers. The feathers and fur on your cows or goats are very similar. The most important part is that you are paying attention to the highlights and shadows. The highlights and the shadows are the most important part about this picture. You want to make sure that the highlights are bringing the image forward and the shadows are giving the illusion that it's going back. When it comes to fur or feathers, you want to make sure that the direction you are coloring is the direction that the fur is growing. That is generally top down. But if you look at my rooster, you can see that some of these feathers curve. The fur of another animal may also have a curve to it. One of the important things to remember when it comes to fur or feathers is to try to randomize the line sizes, colors, and thicknesses. That way it doesn't all look like it's perfectly drawn. You want to make sure that you are looking back at your photo to see where those colors and highlights go, and make sure that you are coloring with several. Here I'm using probably about 5 different shades of colors to get that dimension in my rooster. I like to first find where the darker shadows are, mark that in, then I find the highlights, and then I go in with those orangey red colors of this feather and mark those in. Because the feathers and fur are a little bit imperfect and not smooth, it's okay if you can see the texture of your Prismacolor. Here I have moved on to the greenish blue feathers. I'm still using the same technique, leaving it a little bit fuzzy to give that texture to these feathers, but I'm still following the picture, looking for the highlights and shadows. Remember, the most important thing is that you are following the direction of the fur or whatever you're looking at. You have highlights and you have shadows, and you're using at least 3 to 5 colors for each thing. Now that we have finished coloring the animal, we're going to add texture to the background as well, and finalize a few little details. Now the background should be mostly done. We want it to be a little bit different from the actual animal, so it's not going to have quite as much. But for instance, I'm going through here and I am adding shadows to my trees, so that way it looks more realistic. And then adding a few shadows to the trees that are even further behind those individual ones. Don't forget, this is a good time to go in and add other small details. For instance, here I wanted to add a fence in, so I'm coloring the fence poles with Prismacolors. Also remembering to include highlights and shadows as well. Now I'm going through and I'm actually adding a few grass blades to the front and then along the fence line to create a little bit of a shadow and represent that even though the grass is cut in my picture, they always can't get around the fencing. Now, because I wanted my fence to be made of wire and I wanted it really thin, I'm actually decided that instead of a Prismacolor, because it's not very sharp, I'm actually going to go through with my pencil and I'm going to use a straight edge and just draw in each of those lines. That way it can stay nice and skinny and not take away from too much of my picture.